As we know from experience, no organization is completely safe from compromise. Hi everybody, it's Drew Williams with Guidacent, and this time around we're going to be talking about what is a risk and the different kinds of risks. For example, something as simple as standing on the back deck of your home might not constitute a real high risk, but you certainly wouldn't want to walk out on one of those places. And as history continues to collide with our current events, all business activities carry an element of risk, and many organizations are far less prepared for a compromise than what they may think. The exposure to these risks is managed through the practice of risk management activities that are established throughout all levels within the organization. In managing risk, it's the company's practice, or at least it should be, to take advantage of potential opportunities while managing and mitigating potential adverse effects. Now, nobody's suggesting that standing out on a busy expressway is a really good idea. It's not a good idea at all. But it certainly is a risk, and it's a risk, as I mentioned, not worth taking. But what about those risks in business that we take all the time and we don't realize the consequences should one of those risks be exploited? And defining what a risk is and how it impacts an organization can take on many different shapes and sizes. So there's always a risk of some sort, and what a calculated risk is for one organization may be different for another. And managing and mitigating risk is the responsibility of everyone in the company. But managing risk may be far less challenging if we understand what those risks are and where they're most likely to originate. Cybersecurity risk refers to the potential of loss or harm to a critical information system within an organization. And pretty much every organization in today's digital world is more vulnerable to cyber threats, most likely due to the increase in reliance on distributed and remote computing environments, programs, and of course, the almighty social media. And risk represents the potential for loss or damage when a threat exploits a vulnerability. And data breaches, which are among the more common types of cyber attacks, pose an almost existential threat and potentially devastating impact on businesses of all sizes. These breaches frequently arise from gaps in security controls or processes that have not been fully implemented within an organization. And it's also no longer enough to remain dependent upon traditional reviews and compliance guidelines to ensure that certain level of confidence from being compromised. Organizations are now finding themselves in a really catch-22 situation between paying for tools that seldom get deployed properly and hiring security people who may not be fully aware or qualified to address what's really out there in the wild. And from a risk management perspective, it's the usual suspects: ransomware, phishing, hacking, data leakage, and insider threat. And cybersecurity risks extend beyond damage and destruction of data or monetary loss. The loss of intellectual property, productivity, and reputation are often further collateral damage resulting from a compromise. Some risks are technical, like a component that might turn out to be difficult to deploy or implement within an existing system. Other risks come from outside the environment, like changes in the market or even problems with the weather. And managing risk often equates to balancing between what is expected and what is tolerated, which we often refer to as risk appetite or risk tolerance. And while some organizations are willing to take on too much risk, many others, usually the small to medium-sized businesses, underestimate or undervalue risk to their infrastructures. Further complicating this situation is the emergence of cybersecurity as a popular topic bandied about in corporate boardrooms and executive meetings. And unmanaged IT risk isn't just bad for the organization, it can definitely impact our job security and become a bit of an uphill battle along the way. And all of the common troublemakers are just around the corner, keeping our organizations from successfully addressing this mission-critical issue. Aside from the obvious breaches and disaster recovery shortfalls that many organizations face, inefficiencies in resources, system errors, and good old Mother Nature can have a hand in disrupting our risk management plans. Often, and as a result of oversight and general misinformation, what we see almost systematically is organizations push down their sensitivity to risk as a means of hoping it will go away if no one's looking. But just because you paint it on the side of a piece of steel doesn't make it seaworthy. Business analysts might agree that hope is best suited for planning ball games and picnics under clear skies, while focusing on an organization's risk appetite and tolerance equates to looking carefully at what's at stake rather than leaving it up to chance or the systematic roll of the dice. As I mentioned, one aspect of the definition of risk is understanding how much risk an organization is willing to tolerate, and the other is thinking about how much an organization is willing to invest or spend to manage that risk. And a lot of those issues pertaining to risk begin with internal risks. Internal risks stem from the actions of employees inside the organization. An example of malicious internal cyber risk would be systems sabotage or data theft by a disgruntled employee. An example of unintended internal risk would be an employee who failed to install a security patch on out-of-date software. When effectively integrated with business risk management, IT risk management is the best way to look at a security policy and to cover all of your bases with respect to risk. Without formalized procedures for IT risk management, risk events are often managed after they have occurred, and that means reaction. IT departments that spend most of their time putting out fires receive the lowest ratings for satisfaction and perceived value by the business stakeholders. Ad hoc risk management is often focused only on IT security, when organizations must respond to the entire spectrum of IT risk to be effective. But often, the IT gang can find themselves staring at their bosses with some level of anxiety when trying to explain what happened when a risk was exploited. And even the most carefully planned operations can run into trouble. Team members get sick or quit, or it could be anything that results in resources becoming unavailable. And even the weather can throw something difficult at us, such as a hurricane, or if a volcano decides to wake up and hey, it's happened. These situations, although may appear unlikely, still warrant consideration and review not only based on likelihood, but potential impact to the business. Risk appetite sets the boundaries for prioritizing which risks need to be pursued. And as far as who should be making those decisions that are associated with risk appetite, that's usually a combination of planning and decision-making in the C-suite or senior executives within the organization. Given the many types of cyber risk and their origination points, and with each incident resulting in different degrees of potential impact, prioritization becomes crucial on where to focus our time and efforts toward chasing the right risks. Determining how and where to distribute human, financial, and technology resources includes many variables based on organizational well-being, business priorities, and general governance and potential for legal oversight and external regulatory influence. Further determining cyber risk appetite cannot be based on a single point in time exercise. It must become an ongoing process involving constant evaluation and reevaluation, because you never know if what you are pursuing is even reasonable or that you are properly equipped to accomplish what you set out to do. For many organizations, becoming resilient to cyber attacks requires more than incremental improvements, for example. It requires organizational transformation that broadens the scope of involvement at the top of the organization and instills focus on business risk rather than technology controls. And it often requires the ability to focus on mitigating likely outcomes based on a better, more informed understanding of the consequences of chasing the wrong risks. Knowing where to invest time and resources are essential steps in defining the risk appetite and are critical parts of the process tied to effective and successful risk management. Often those groups that may only be partially informed or aware of the risks they face realize all too late the impact of chasing the wrong risks. And while it seems like setting cyber risk appetite may be just a technical formality, the effort encompasses further collaboration among both technical and non-technical business entities within the organization. Now, we don't want to get into a full-blown seminar on diagramming and cataloging everything about risk management, so for the purpose of keeping this webcast focused on one aspect of the topic, let's briefly review the 4 fundamental approaches to any type of risk. This is often referred to as the A4 methodology. And when evaluating the general level of risk within an organization, there will always be an aspect of uncertainty, stuff that hasn't occurred yet or may be difficult to anticipate. And unfortunately, some of those risks that we plan for do actually occur. And that's when things start to happen that makes business leaders and their staff a bit unsettled, to say the least. Each of these mitigation techniques described in the A4 methodology can be an effective tool in reducing individual risks and the risk profile that may be associated with the infrastructure of any organization. organization. Here's how it looks. The first action in our methodology pertains to avoiding the risk altogether. Risk avoidance usually involves developing an alternative strategy that has a higher probability of success, but often is accompanied by a higher cost associated with accomplishing a set of measurable outcomes or tasks. And one common risk avoidance technique is to use proven and existing technologies or processes rather than adopting something new, even though those new techniques or processes may show promise of better performance or lower costs. A project team may choose a vendor with a proven track record over a new vendor who's providing significant price incentives to avoid the risk of working with a new vendor and taking greater risk. Another example might be when the organization requires drug testing for team members as a means of practicing risk avoidance by avoiding damage done by someone under the influence of drugs, which could result in long-term impact or liability to everyone associated with that risk. And certainly the best action an organization can take with respect to a risk of any kind is to avoid it altogether. If you can prevent a risk from occurring, or worse, developing into something even more damaging, it's in the best interest of everyone to do so. The easiest way to avoid this type of risk, if returning to our roadside analogy, is to walk away from the highway and consider the potentially painful and damaging consequences associated with jumping out in front of oncoming traffic. Or in this example, wanting to get a closer look at the pretty bears as they appear to sing and dance in the road. But surprisingly, there may be need to take such a risk, and there still may be a need to walk out into the traffic. Faced with a situation that you know has risk and you know you aren't going to be able to avoid it, apply or mitigate the appropriate controls and processes you have available to address the issue while minimizing the risk. This means taking some sort of action that will result in the risk doing as little damage to your infrastructure as possible. Risk mitigation equates to preparing for and reducing the effects of threats faced by a business as a result of a risk being exploited. Also, risk mitigation refers to how an organization may take steps to reduce the negative effects of threats and disasters on business continuity as well. Risk assignment involves partnering with others to share responsibility for those activities deemed as risky business. For example, many organizations that often find themselves working on or responsible for international projects will reduce political, legal, labor, and other risks associated with such projects by developing a joint venture with a company located in that country. In other situations, weather, political unrest, and labor strikes are further examples of events that can significantly impact an organization which are also outside the purview or control of the organization itself. Partnerships through which associated risks are often shared is a safer bet, especially when the other team or organization has expertise and experience the host firm may be missing. Risk assignment is also an example of how risk may be transferred to an external entity. If a risk event does occur, then the partnering company absorbs some or all of the negative impact of that event. The most common way to do this is to buy insurance, and in this guy's case, he'd better hope he had a whole lot of it. But in the world of IT management, assigning risk more commonly equates to assigning services out to a managed security service provider or MSSP, and incorporating controls such as security incident and event monitoring tools or SIEMs, firewalls, and multi-factor authentication tools deployed throughout a system are additional methods we may implement when assigning cyber risk. Assigning or contracting with skilled project personnel to manage the high-risk activities is another risk reduction method. And experts managing high-risk activities often have the means of predicting problems and identifying solutions that may otherwise prevent those activities from resulting in long-term consequences if such risks become exploited. And finally, our fourth methodology component lies with accepting the risk. Accepting risk occurs when the organization acknowledges that the potential loss from a risk is not great enough to warrant investing the necessary time and resources needed to avoid it altogether. When you can't avoid, mitigate, or assign a risk, then you have to accept its inevitability. And even when you accept a risk, at least you've looked at the alternatives and you accept the consequences of any potential fallout from that risk. If you can't avoid the risk and there's nothing nothing you can do to reduce its impact, then accepting it is your only choice. We as human beings are famously bad at understanding risk. For example, the mere fact that our trip out there onto the highway is far more dangerous than flying in an airplane doesn't stop us from calmly driving to the airport, only to white-knuckle our way through a flight, or worse, as in the case of this poor soul, jumping out of a perfectly good airplane for the thrill. And just a bit of social science here. While psychologists have identified many reasons for this heightened paranoia, one particularly influential cause is the fact that the excitement and drama surrounding unlikely events actually strengthens memory of those events, allowing us to all believe that rare events are more likely to occur than they actually do. It's probably similar to betting on the lottery. In cybersecurity risk management, though, this scenario manifests itself when organizations overestimate risks that are predicted to become most significant and underestimating those everyday risks that may actually be more likely and more significant on the operation. So now that we've diagrammed risk, what are the other critical elements we should be concerned with? And what else, you might ask, is lying in the dark waiting to bite us in the business? So we have threats, we have vulnerabilities, and we have risks. A threat is a potential negative action or event facilitated by a vulnerability that results in an unwanted impact to a computer system or application or the critical infrastructure as a whole. A threat can be either a negative intentional event, such as a hack, or an accidental negative event, such as the possibility of a computer malfunctioning, or the possibility of a natural disaster event, such as an earthquake, or a hurricane, or this guy. A vulnerability, on the other hand, refers to a known weakness within an asset or resource that could be exploited by one or more bad guys. In the world of cybersecurity, a vulnerability is defined as being a weakness that can be exploited by a threat actor, such as an attacker, to cross privilege boundaries within a computer system and gain unauthorized access for nefarious purposes. Vulnerabilities can allow attackers to run code, access a system's memory, install malware, and steal, destroy, or modify sensitive data, or those elements deemed as the crown jewels of an organization. So how does all of this equate into what your organization can do right now to reduce and begin managing risk? Well, there are 4 key steps you can take that can help you begin to step safely out into those busy intersections between risk and operation. First, understand your risk profile, and this equates to implementing a measurable organization-wide security risk assessment, and by that there are really 2 parts. First is identifying critical enterprise risks that determine the applications, the systems, databases, and processes subject to cyber risk. And then second, engage in a risk assessment and be sure to include all stakeholders to assess the likelihood and potential impact and exposure to cyber risk. And by the way, part of this effort should also include reviewing third-party exposure given the increased risks related to this so-called new normal as a result of expanding technology perimeters due to work-from-home requirements. And second, establish an organizational strategy. Last time we discussed adopting a cybersecurity framework through which an organization can more effectively prioritize risks throughout its infrastructure and permit better allocation of resources. But that's only part of this particular activity. You also need to be sure to define and communicate what must be an organization-wide IT and cybersecurity risk management strategy so that everyone understands, accepts, and adheres with the framework and expectations. Third, invest in your cybersecurity risk management infrastructure. Assess system requirements to understand where organizational cyber threats might originate within your organization. And certainly provide guidelines that set expectations for types of systems, controls, and processes that are required to be effective in reducing risk. A distributed cloud-based organization, for example, will have different needs from an organization that relies on physical assets. And finally, establish solid cybersecurity risk management processes. Now, we've talked a lot about processes in the past, and one of the most underestimated and easiest processes to deploy is through security awareness training. As technology continues to increase its capabilities almost exponentially, so too are those risks relating to staying out on the cutting edge of business. Risk management isn't a static undertaking and requires constant grooming, so to speak. Organizations can spend their entire operating budgets on the next shiny object that comes along relating to critical infrastructure security, but to remain effective effective, your cyber risk management posture must include measurable and informed content in regular training sessions. So managing cyber risk goes beyond identifying who's climbing the mountain with you or who's crossing the highway. It's everybody's responsibility. Cyber risk has the potential to affect every aspect of any organization, including our customers, the employees, our partners, vendors, assets, and reputation as a whole. As such, an effective cyber risk management program involves the entire organization. And just one quick mention, our consulting teams at Guidacent view cybersecurity and risk management as elements to help organizations develop strong, secure operating environments, which extends the value of our digital infrastructure and economy as a whole. If your organization would like to explore how to evaluate and address risk and build on the integrity of your critical assets, contact us at cybersecurity@guidacent.com.
So there are lots of different kinds of risk, lots of different levels of risk, and depending upon the type of business an organization finds itself in, may determine its risk appetite. And that risk appetite will determine also the level of control and processes put around each of those risks that are identified and what they're anticipated to be. As far as I'm concerned, however, standing on the back balcony of my house is a whole lot safer than standing in the middle of a highway. That's not a risk I'm willing to take. And with that, for Guidacent, I'm Drew Williams, and thanks for being with us today.